Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about paternalism and proportionality, and this will cover the anchor reading from week 9 of the syllabus. So the anchor reading is focused on plain packaging and cigarettes. And it's raising questions about whether plain packaging of cigarettes is paternalistic in a way that's problematic from an ethical perspective. And it's also raising questions about whether plain packaging is proportional. And in the course of this discussion, Anchor distinguishes a bunch of different ways you could understand what paternalism and proportionality mean. And those can all be kind of tricky to keep in your head. And so the main focus of this lecture will be to explain these different concepts to you so you can have a good understanding of them. So let's jump in with the paternalism. There's 3 of these types of paternalism, and each type has sort of two sort of varieties. So paternalism, restricting someone's freedom for their own good. So that means to have paternalism, there's got to be some restriction on freedom. And the reason why that person's freedom is being restricted has to be for their benefit, not, for example, in order to prevent harm to some third party. That wouldn't be paternalism if that's what the goal is. So 3 types of paternalism that are discussed by Anchor. These are soft versus hard, weak versus strong, and pure versus impure. That might be a lot to remember, but fortunately cartoons can help us understand them. So let's start with soft paternalism. So a classic example of this idea is a person is going to cross this bridge, but doesn't know this bridge is in imminent danger of collapse. And the key idea here is that the person is about to take this risk to cross the bridge, but they don't know that they're taking this risk. They don't know how risky what they're doing really is. And in this kind of case, it seems intuitive that it would be justifiable to stop this person and tell them, don't cross the bridge. It's about to collapse, right? To warn them before they cross the bridge, to stop them and warn them before they put themselves unknowingly at risk. So the key idea for soft paternalism is the person voluntarily undertaking this risk? Do they know that the risk is there? And are they in a state where they can cognitively, rationally understand this risk and appreciate its consequences? And so if the person is either uninformed or if they're impaired cognitively in some way, so for example, the person might, maybe have had too much to drink and they're not really in a state where they can make a reasonable decision. In a case like that, it might be justified to restrict their freedom. Another way where a person's behavior might not be fully voluntary is because they're too young to understand the risks and understand what they're getting themselves into by this decision. Hard paternalism, on the other hand, is a case where the person is informed about the risk. They are not cognitively impaired. They're old enough to understand what's going on and to appreciate the consequences. And so hard paternalism would be refusing to allow someone to take a risk in such a case. So if a person, for instance, wants to do rock climbing, they fully understand the risks, they're not cognitively impaired, but you say, no, you can't do it, it's too dangerous, that would be like hard paternalism. If we think about what does hard versus soft paternalism have to do with plain packaging, we could ask, is plain packaging soft or hard paternalism? Well, for it to be paternalism at all, it's got to be restricting someone's freedom, and it's got to be, and if it's soft paternalism, it's doing that, but the person doesn't really understand the risks. So one way you might think it's soft paternalism is if some people don't really appreciate the risks of smoking, if they don't really understand how bad it really would be to get lung cancer. You also might think that a package like this one might encourage people to think misleadingly that smoking is healthy, right? That here's this tough guy, he's smoking and he seems really healthy. Well, so maybe smoking isn't so bad for your health. That would be one way to think about how it could be soft paternalism, because people don't really understand the risks. Another way you might think of it as being soft paternalism is that some people might be too young to understand the risks. If people start smoking when they're very young and then sort of become, sort of addicted to the cigarettes, and that's another way it might be soft paternalism. Another question is it paternalism at all? Because you might think that, well, look, the plain packaging doesn't stop people from smoking. If you want to smoke, you can still buy the cigarettes. It's just they have this yucky, picture on the cover of them. But Anchor suggests that, in fact, it is paternalism because some people might want not only the cigarettes, but the packaging itself might be important. That maybe the packaging is a way of expressing their identity as like, a tough Marlboro man kind of person. And that's another thing we can discuss in class. Is this paternalism at all? And that kind of turns on, is there something about the package itself that's desirable that people want? Weak versus strong paternalism. This is one that can be a little tricky to distinguish from soft versus hard, but hopefully we can understand the difference. So in weak paternalism, you support the person's goal, but you sort of restrict their freedom in how they're achieving it. So in this example, you can imagine this is like, two friends, maybe they're roommates, and the roommate knows that her friend really wants to stick to her diet, but is really susceptible to be tempted by cookies. And if she sees the cookies, might just binge them all down all at once. And so her friend hides the cookies in the closet so her friend won't find them and can stick to her diet. So in this case, she's restricting the freedom of the other person, but doing it in order to support the goal that the person has. So a key idea of weak paternalism is often a distinction between the person's real, authentic preference, what they really want, and something they might, in the moment, just choose as a result of temptation. When we think of strong paternalism, that's going to mean that the person really is acting on what they really want. So here the Cookie Monster doesn't care about diets, doesn't care about diabetes, doesn't care about gaining weight, only cares about cookies. And the person here is, well, just too bad. You can't have them. I'm telling you what you want is just a bad thing. You shouldn't want to eat cookies all the time. That's unhealthy. And so there's a difference from the strong versus hard paternalism in that the focus isn't so much on, is the person informed? Are they cognitively impaired or not? It's not really that. It's really this focus on what is the person's real, authentic desire? What do they really want? And do you support that thing that they really want or not? If we think of an example of weak paternalism in connection with tobacco, we're now very familiar with, you go to the grocery store, the tobacco products are hidden in a cupboard out of sight. And if you wanted to buy them, you'd have to go to a desk and, ask the person, I have to ask the person working there to go unlock this cupboard and get the cigarettes for you. That's very similar, obviously, to hiding the cookies in the closet, right? The idea is that for people who want to quit smoking or want to, not start smoking, that's a lot easier to do if the cigarettes are out of sight, in the same way as sticking to the diet is easier if the cookies are out of sight. Pure paternalism versus impure paternalism. And this has to do with who's restricted and who's benefiting from the paternalism. Pure paternalism arises when those restricted are identical to those who benefit. A simple example would be, imagine this person who wants to bungee jump from the CN Tower in Toronto. And there's a security guard who sees this person, running up to the top floor to go bungee jumping and, stops them and says, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do this. So in this case, the person whose freedom is restricted is the would-be bungee jumper, but that's also the person who's benefiting because, of course, it's better for him that he doesn't jump because that's really dangerous to do that. And so the person who's restricted and the person who's benefited, they're the same. It could be more than one person who's restricted, but as long as all those people who are being restricted are also people who are benefiting, you've got pure paternalism. Impure paternalism, on the other hand, arises when you have those being restricted is a broader class of people than those who benefit. This will often occur when you have a product of some kind that is being regulated in some way, as in the case of plain packaging laws for cigarettes. So here, this restricts not only the consumer who maybe would like to buy, a package of cigarettes with this pretty, logo on it, but also the people who sell the cigarettes. And now if we think of who benefits from this, well, it's clearly mainly the smokers or would-be smokers who benefit because their smoking might be reduced. So this guy might decide to quit, or he might smoke less, or it might be someone who just decides not to smoke at all because the packages don't look like this. They look, instead of like having this pretty camel picture, they have a picture of someone who's dying of lung cancer. And, that makes the smoking seem a lot less appealing. So the smokers or would-be smokers are the ones who benefit. But the tobacco company, the people there are also restricted, and those people may not benefit from this restriction. In fact, you can imagine that the tobacco executive here doesn't even smoke at all and just loses money from this, right? So they're restricted in their freedom, but they're not benefiting from this restriction. So that's impure paternalism. So 3 types of proportionality. And again, one of the questions that Anchor wants to ask is, are plain packaging, is that proportional to the actual risks? And so there's sort of there's 3 types of proportionality. So the first one, means ends. This is something we've encountered before in this term when we learned about Childress and colleagues, a framework for public health ethics. In that framework, proportionality was one of the principles, and the idea was that if you've got some public health intervention that improves population health, then you also want to think about, does it have any downsides? Does it restrict freedom? Is it unfair in some way? And then you want to ask, do those downsides, outweigh the benefits, or do the benefits justify imposing whatever those downsides are? And so that's the kind of means ends proportionality. So in the case of plain packaging, Anchor wonders about, well, people might feel harmed, they might feel stigmatized as a result of these plain packages with these sort of unpleasant pictures on the cover, and that harm needs to be weighed against the benefits in terms of the smoking reduction. Material proportionality has to do with whether the warnings are misleadingly suggesting that something really improbable is actually very common. And so here the concern from Anchor is that these types of plain packaging will often display some type of cancer that's actually quite rare, and that somebody viewing this like the oral cancer might think, oh geez, if I smoke, I'm going to get this horrible disease. And so this is a sort of different type of proportionality concern. This concern raises sort of a few questions. One is like, how likely should an adverse outcome have to be before you could depict it on a label? What sort of threshold would be reasonable? And it also raises questions about, is it about the relative risk or the absolute risk? So in this case, the relative risk is quite high. If we're talking about oral cancer is about like 5 to 10 times more likely among smokers than non-smokers. You get a big increase of the relative risk from smoking. However, the absolute risk is still quite low. It's like less than 1%. So even if you smoke, you're probably not going to get oral cancer, but you're a lot more likely to get it than if you don't smoke. So material proportionality, which of these risks, absolute or relative, is it about? Okay. Finally, relative proportionality is relating to comparisons between different types of products or different types of policies. So the idea is that if a policy is judged acceptable for case X, like say cigarette packaging, and Y is similar to X, so maybe Y is like packaging for really unhealthy processed foods. So if it's justifiable in the first case, then it should be acceptable and justifiable in that second case too. And so here Anchor argues that, well, if you think that these plain packaging, these kinds of labels with like these awful pictures, if these are justifiable for cigarettes, then they should be justifiable for potato chips and all kinds of things like that. And Anchor seems to suggest, well, that isn't really reasonable. So maybe it's not right to put these awful looking pictures on the cigarette packages. And that raises some interesting questions we can discuss in class, like what makes two cases similar? Are, unhealthy foods and cigarettes, are they really so similar, or is there some important difference between them? And it also raises the question, well, maybe, you should put warning labels, or you should put some kind of label on really unhealthy foods in the same way that you would have for cigarettes. Maybe that's the right answer rather than questioning the labels for the cigarettes. Okay, so there's a lot here for us to discuss in class, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.